Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news and welcome to the Canadian Grand Prix weekend. Mercedes believe they've figured out the secrets behind Red Bull's flaw, but they actually don't seem to think it's good as they thought it might have been. They say there's a couple of areas they might even look to improve upon. Does this mean Mercedes don't fully understand Red Bull's concept, or is it more likely that it's the suspension that's giving Red Bull the majority of their edge? Very much intrigued to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. First of all, as always, we've got to look at some of the rear wings because that's the first thing that comes out every single weekend. Before we get to that though, there's been some discussions on which teams are bringing upgrades. We know that Aston Martin are bringing a lot, to such an extent that Lawrence Stroll seems incredibly confident that they're going to get a double podium. Not just Alonso on the podium, they reckon Stroll as well, which is possibly optimistic, who knows. Stroll has an occasional good race in him, and it is probably going to rain this weekend. Is that good or bad for Stroll? That's a matter of debate. We talked him down a little bit yesterday because his rating in Formula 123, the game, might be a little bit higher than expected for some of the aspects. But yes, Alpine also, they've got upgrades. Ferrari though, they're still looking for answers, and that's another key storyline this weekend. There were some rumours going around that they're actually looking to bring a new rear suspension and test around some front wing ideas, but Giuliano De Kessa says non-credo, as in I don't believe that to be true. So yeah, we'll see if anything happens with Ferrari, because they were alright here last year. They almost won. Sainz was chasing down Verstappen, was in his DRS, but could never get close enough because the Red Bull was just too fast in a straight line, and Leclerc had to start from the back because of a engine penalty, right, that he had to take already at that point in the season. Alonso though was on the front row last year, was he not? And that was in an Alpine in wet conditions, and we might have more wet conditions and a very similar setup, but Alonso in a better car. These are the rear wings then, and once again you'll notice here that comparing the angles on these, the Red Bull is significantly higher. This is more of a medium high downforce setup. The Ferrari, the Mercedes, the Alpine, maybe medium low downforce, depending on what they decide to do. And it's a tricky track, Canada, because there's a lot of slower corners where you'd like the extra downforce, but there's also a lot of straight lines where you need, I mean, in fairness, most of the straights have DRS. There is one down into the hairpin that doesn't have DRS, so that's where you can gain an edge, because Red Bull can happily run extra wing, maintain their tyres better, faster in some of the corners, and their DRS is so good anyway that they gain back a lot of that advantage that they might lose on the straights. Where they might lose a bit of time is on the run down into the hairpin, where with no DRS, then you're going to struggle a little bit more theoretically, but we'll see. I mean, this is the Grand Prix weekend hasn't even started yet. The teams can change these up over the weekend, but again, we see Red Bull leaning towards a higher downforce mode, whereas the other teams need slightly lower downforce to even compete with Red Bull in a straight line, and that then conveys other disadvantages to them over the course of the weekends. Aston Martin, though, extremely confident they're going to do well here, so I'm very much looking forward to their upgrades. I know there's lots of optimism that maybe this is the weekend where Alonso manages to beat Verstappen and actually take a victory. Surely it's got to happen eventually. But it is, of course, difficult to look past Verstappen at the moment. Just quickly as well, unfortunately, Mika Häkkinen, legendary driver, especially for McLaren, might have lost his mind a little bit. He's making these comments on the fact that it's going to be McLaren that are going to challenge Red Bull over the coming months, and they're going to make massive progress. I don't know what he's smoking here. If this happens, fair play. He was also commenting on Hamilton losing his kind of, mindset to be in racing 100%, which I feel like someone has said at some point every season since Hamilton came into the sport, and it never really seems to be the case. And Hamilton is very much committed to racing, and we believe he's going to sign the contract relatively soon. That's the Häkkinen piece over with. Let's talk about the Red Bull flaw, because this has been a key talking point ever since Perez crashed it in the Monaco Grand Prix qualifying session, and we got to see what's going on with Red Bull under the floor. Now, they say it doesn't matter too much that people see it. We've got a new floor coming anyway, but it's the design, development, philosophy, direction, and what they've done with the aero there that many teams are looking at. We know that Adrian Newey, ground effect legend, even before last year's regulations come into effect, they come in, Red Bull are the best car. Is that a massive surprise? Maybe not, but it's how all of the pieces work together, and the floor is obviously a large part of that. So James Allison said shortly after Monaco, he was like, yeah, look, we got a good look at those pictures, and there's many photographers that will get good pictures, better quality than this, and send them to the teams. Like, their inboxes apparently are just flooded with this Red Bull imagery, and obviously the team has been going into some serious detail, as all the teams I'm sure have, to try and decipher what's going on here, what are all the different contours, how are Red Bull designing their floor, where have they got the different elements working together, and it's going to be helpful information for Mercedes. This is by comparison the Ferrari, the Mercedes, the Red Bull. The Mercedes from this angle looks quite complicated as well, and of course it is second, third, fourth fastest car, depends on the weekend at the moment, but the Mercedes is also going to be pretty well advanced on the floor side, whereas the Williams, for example, we saw the image there, which didn't look particularly special. So they've looked into what Red Bull have done, and Toto Wolff has now given the comment on it. He's asked his engineers, what can we glean from that information? What do you guys think about it? What can we steal from their concept to put onto ours? It's fundamentally what they're trying to get across. But he actually reckons that the Mercedes engineers weren't particularly convinced about it. It's clearly fast, there's no doubt about that, and as Toto Wolff says, for me, if it's complex or not, if it's fast, it is good, which is true. It works well with the other elements of the car. The floor is certainly very fast. That floor, the Red Bull floor, I asked the question about the complexity of it into my engineering group, and they said there are interesting things they can analyze as part of the airflow function. So that's one benefit that Mercedes and other teams have from this imagery, but they weren't convinced about the beauty, the aesthetics of the flow, and just how it functions. Kind of saying that they believe there's elements that can be improved upon, and Red Bull probably think the same, because Max Verstappen said a couple of weeks ago now that there's a brand new floor coming. Maybe it was a week or so ago after Spain. He was like, yeah, we've got a new floor coming anyway soon enough that's going to gain us 3/10. So don't look too much into those images, was kind of the point. So maybe Red Bull have got further upgrades to bring to their floor down the line. But it is quite interesting to hear that Mercedes haven't seen the Red Bull floor and thought, wow, this is unbelievable. I can't believe the level of complexity they're going into. They're like, yeah, this is pretty, run-of-the-mill. I mean, they don't seem to think there's that much complexity there. They don't think it's particularly beautiful, which doesn't really matter much if it's fast, right? But yeah, the aesthetics of the flow and how it functions, they're not convinced that it's as good as it could be, is definitely the implication here. Now, we can talk about the potential of no changes in the regulations for the rest of the year, but this is quite interesting, right? What is causing this? Do Mercedes just not understand the detail, right? That seems unlikely. If your entire engineering department is looking at it and thinking, well, we can improve here, it's unlikely that they're entirely missing the point. Maybe what's more likely is that this implies that the real secret behind their success, Red Bull, is not necessarily in the floor, but is more so in the suspension. And I feel like this has been an understanding, and I think over the last several months, it's gone from a discussion around, oh, the floor must be unbelievable, to, well, it's the suspension setup they've got, which is giving them the advantage. Probably from the floor as well to a certain degree, but we've talked about this over the last several months, the anti-dive, anti-squat suspension that also Aston Martin have employed, and Mercedes' new front suspension is closer to this setup. So the idea of this is that when the car, imagine a bike, for example, when you brake, if you brake too hard, you're going to go over on yourself, right? Because the bike is going to dip down and dive when you brake from a high speed. A car does the same thing, but to a slightly lesser extent, and you can set up the suspension to help that or to try and hinder that and prevent the car from doing anything. If you can prevent the car from moving at all when you brake or you accelerate, it's always perfectly flat within reason, you can gain some advantage. It has downsides as well. Red Bull suffer a bit more in terms of front tyre warm-up. Perez certainly suffered with that back in Australia. Their qualifying as a result isn't as good, but it gives them a lot of advantage because their car is so flat all the time. They can run it at a consistent ride height where they know what it's going to do. It also benefits because the car is super low in terms of straight line speed. It can give some advantages as well, and it seems like Red Bull understand this. Aston Martin got this as well, and the other teams will probably start to introduce that a bit more. But I think the anti-dive on the Red Bull suspension was about 3 times as much as any other team was doing. Maybe Mercedes are slightly closer to that now, but this comment from the Mercedes engineers says, well, the floor isn't really anything spectacular. It's the suspension that's potentially giving Red Bull their mega edge, and other teams will need to figure that out for next season, because Mercedes can change their front suspension this year, which they have done. Changing the rear suspension, though, is more of a challenge with the gearbox in play and all these other factors back there that make it difficult to really adjust. But I imagine for the last few months, Mercedes were trying to piece everything together in terms of where is their edge, where can we catch up, and maybe this is an understanding from Mercedes to know, okay, it's not necessarily the floor that's unbelievable, there's other factors, and they know where those other factors are that are giving Red Bull the advantage, especially in race conditions where they've been untouchable so far this season. So definitely intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. The other piece, of course, of that interview was discussions from Toto Wolff on the possibility of changing the rules. Now, he's not going to say they should do this. As he says, there's no more talk about changing the regulations or raising the floor edges. There probably will be some small tweaks for next season, but you can't imagine it's going to be anything mega. And even as Stefano Domenicali says, we're not going to be manipulating the championship. Now, you can talk all you want about manipulation of championships over the last several years and some potentially rather recent examples, but as he says, it is not correct because we cannot be seen as a part of a manipulation. This is not correct, and this is not fair. I'm not imagining at all this kind of approach to try and pull Red Bull back to stop them them dominating. And honestly, whenever changes have been made to try and slow down a team, they haven't always worked. Sometimes they have, sometimes they haven't. And often what happens, well, at least should happen here, theoretically, is that over the span of these regulations until 2026, the cars behind Red Bull get more and more competitive to the point where in 2025 we have a banger championship, just like 2012. That would be the ideal case scenario. Might not happen, but that is often how it goes, that the regulations arrive, one team dominates, and then over the course of the next 2, 3, 4 years, other teams catch up. You have a great championship, and then the rules change again for the next year, and again, there's another team dominating, right? Which might happen in 2026. So we'll see what they can achieve. Just before we close out the video, though, wanted to mention the forecast for this weekend. It's changing quite a bit, but I did just look on Google Weather, and they say that for Saturday, for sure it's going to rain. Sunday's unclear. Friday, it might not rain for practice, but it might rain in the evening. It's almost certain that rain will not necessarily disrupt, but affect the weekend to some degree. Whether that's rain during quali, which would be fun, as it was last year, or the race itself, or whether it's just the track is wet before the race starts, or in an ideal case scenario, the track is dry, and then it rains relatively early into the race. That'd be beautiful as well. I'd very much enjoy to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.